the newsagents.
Mr. Speaker, would the Prime Minister be prepared personally to repeat the allegation made by his business secretary that the former chair of the Post Office is lying when he says he was told to go slow on compensation for postmasters and limp to the next election?
That was Keir Starmer in the Commons this lunchtime. Two things to say about that. One, he had his barrister's voice on, which normally puts the fear of God into the Conservatives because he's rather effective as a barrister. And two, when Rishi Sunak answered, he absolutely swerved round the question and would not back Kemi Badenoch's use of words.
As the business secretary said on Monday, she asked Henry Staunton to step down after serious concerns were raised. She set out the reasons for this and the full background in the House earlier this week. But importantly, we have also taken unprecedented steps to ensure that victims of the Horizon scandal...
Today, we're going to be looking at that row between Kemi Badenoch and the former chair of the Post Office, who she has accused outright of lying. She is the front runner for the Tory leadership in a post-Rishi Sunak world. How damaging will this row be to her? And why won't the Prime Minister give her his backing? Welcome to the newsagents.
And it was a very telling Prime Minister's questions, because gone was Keir Starmer, the politician, and back was Keir Starmer, the barrister, just as he was with Boris Johnson in prosecutorial mode, not Partygate this time, but Kemi Badenoch's really outspoken attack on the former chair of the Post Office, Henry Staunton, and the role that he'd played and the reason for his firing, and his claim that he has since backed up that senior civil servants were telling him to go slow on a financial settlement for postmasters and postmistresses for no other reason than the government just didn't want to spend that money out now before an election.
Yeah, and this all goes back to the Horizon scandal, the Post Office scandal, and an interview at the week, and what Henry Staunton has said. He was sacked by Kemi Badenoch. He became the kind of, if not fall guy, but the guy who was the kind of, his head was on the block and he lost it. Now, he has this week, since we talked about this on Monday, he has released a note that he claims proves that he was told to stall compensation payments to postmasters. This memo records a top civil servant saying now was not the time for dealing with long-term issues and they should hobble up to the next election. Basically, i.e., that they shouldn't reopen the financial settlement with postmasters because the government just didn't have the money. The government is coming back on that and saying, no, this wasn't related to the Post Office scandal. This was Post Office's finances in general. The point is that Kemi Badenoch said at the weekend that if Staunton had any evidence to back up his allegations, then come out with it and prove it. And Staunton is saying, I have done. And therefore, you've misled the House of Commons.
I think something interesting is going on here, because you can argue that Henry Staunton is only proving notes that he himself wrote. So we know that after his conversation where he was told by Sarah Munby, then Permanent Secretary at the Department for Business, he was told, don't rip off the Band-Aid on finances, right? That's the story that the Times has broken today. But the only corroboration we have, the only evidence we have, is that he then went off and wrote a note to his colleague at the Post Office saying, this is what I've been told. We don't actually have a form of words from Sarah Munby or from a civil servant telling us that that happened. What is interesting about that is that Kemi Badenoch could have chosen to say, sorry, can I see a bit more evidence? Or, gosh, let's see where that came from. We need to investigate. She didn't. She just went out and called him a liar. And so curiously, whereas the balance of sort of probability had to lie with him, first of all, if you've got the evidence, please produce it, show it. Now I think it's tipped to her to actually have to prove how she knows, without any investigation, that he's telling lies. And I think that's where Keir Starmer went straight for the jugular, because you're right, it was exactly what he did to Boris Johnson over Partygate. We're in the House of Commons. Can I just get confirmation that she absolutely knows he lied? Because that's quite a serious accusation.
Look, what we do have is the chairman of the post office, a guy who has lived his life in the shadows, but at the most senior level in the biggest companies in the country. So he knows his way around corporate responsibility and taking notes and informing others. He sent an email to the chief executive of the post office immediately after he had taken contemporaneous notes of his conversation with the permanent secretary. I think that is pretty compelling. I think that anyone who knows anything about corporate governance would say he did all the right things, he took a note, he sent an email alerting the chief executive to what he'd just been told by the permanent secretary. I think that is important and is significant. And then on the other side of the ledger, you've got Kemi Badenoch coming out all guns blazing at a time when the public sympathy on this issue is not with the government, is not with the way the government has handled the whole scandal of the way these sub-postmasters and sub-postmistresses have been treated. And so Kemi Badenoch now is looking pretty damn exposed, having done what she's done and said it in the way that she said it.
Why wouldn't you investigate what a whistleblower is telling you? Why would you assume that a whistleblower was lying at a time when we have had scandal after scandal, the blood scandal, the infected blood scandal, the post office scandal? The victims have constantly been told things that weren't true, and there have been cover-ups, decades of cover-ups. And I think that's where she seems to fall the wrong side of where the public sits right now.
But this is what was interesting about Starmer and PMQs today, because this was the first PMQs back after recess where there had been a lot of political water passed under the bridge over the last couple of weeks. You know, there's been by-elections, there had been the 28 billion, the flip-flop, all of this stuff, and everyone was expecting this quite hostile, quite frothy PMQs. And it wasn't. Starmer decided to go on this very limited kind of subject and exchange. And I think that is because not only he, the Labour Party, but frankly, quite a bit of Westminster now is potentially starting to scent blood. Because this is ultimately a question of whether Badenoch has not only been quite incompetent in the way that she's handled this. Yes, she always responds, you know, she only really seems to have one mode, which is she goes on the attack, she goes on the front foot. It isn't just with this issue, there are lots of things that people listening to this, certainly I had forgotten about different issues that had come up over the last couple of years since she'd been a minister, and the way that she handles things, particularly with regards to journalists. But she has potentially misled the House of Commons, which is very serious. And what's really interesting about this as well is that when, like, the skids are under you as a minister, lots of other things start to come out of the woodwork, and suddenly the attention and the gaze is on you. So there's this other story about Badenoch in the Financial Times today, which is, again, a pretty amazing story, which she is now locked in this new political row over a claim that she has been engaged in trade talks with Canada, negotiations that the Canadian government have said this week do not exist.
Shut it down, didn't they?
Badenoch told MPs on January the 29th that talks with Canada to avoid a March 31st tariff cliff edge for UK car makers are ongoing. But the Canadian High Commissioner has written to the House of Commons Business Select Committee to insist that Badenoch's claim that the talks are going on have not occurred. I mean, this is also serious stuff about misleading the House of Commons.
I think your point about scenting blood is absolutely key, because she has got such a definite presentational manner, right? That's euphemism, but
that's a very nice way of putting it, I believe.
She just calls it out. She will say you're wrong. She'll say that's not true.
She's not afraid of pissing
She'll
people
say
off.
You're a liar.
Yeah.
She's not the world's best diplomat.
No.
And I think as long as you're right when you say those things, people say, "Oh, I really like Kemi's style. She tells it as it is. She's not afraid to call it out. She tells you if you're wrong." The trouble is, the moment people think you might have got one thing wrong, they start revisiting all the other instances where you have opened yourself up to being definite about things you've got wrong. It's the trade deals with Canada. You mentioned the journalist. There was a case a couple of years ago with some of our colleagues where she actually doxed a journalist, on Twitter.
Attacked her.
She attacked her for doing what she does as a journalist, asking questions of a minister.
She asked for a comment about
She
the
asked
story.
for a comment, and I think that relationship that she clearly has or had with the press at that time does not suggest somebody who runs towards the democratic process.
She does not like journalists.
It's not a good place to be.
Look, the piece of academic kind of work that I love is Kremlinology, about who is sitting next to who on the May Day parade next to Leonid Brezhnev. And I don't want to be too Kremlinological about this.
You have to say it first.
Yeah, I just Kremlinological.
You were around at that May Day parade.
Yeah, I was,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
The fact of the matter was, today, this was an obvious subject that might come up. Kemi Badenoch was not in the Commons anywhere near Rishi Sunak. Rishi Sunak was twice asked to back up Kemi Badenoch's accusation of lies. Rishi Sunak studiously avoided it. And Lewis, you said a moment ago that she could be in trouble for misleading Parliament. She could be in trouble for libel. If Henry Staunton decides that he has been libelled by her, she didn't say that the word lying under privilege in the Commons, which means you can't. She did it on Twitter. He can.
Yeah, and she said that this was all about him trying to basically manage his reputation, him trying to create excuses for why he was sacked. So it has got very personal between them, and that is indeed, as Emily was saying, kind of her form. And the reason this matters, and I do think we should just dwell again on the fact that the Prime Minister has been asked in the House of Commons, and not just him, this aligns with what his spokesperson has been asked about all week, whether they are willing to back up that claim that Staunton has lied, and repeatedly Number 10, and indeed Sunak on the floor of the House of Commons today, have declined to do so, which is a pretty amazing state of affairs.
Well, I think this goes back to the criminology, actually, because who gains from Kemi Badenoch screwing up?
Yeah, her star falling.
Quite a lot of them, right? Because she at the moment, or she has been leading in the polls of sort of most favoured leader to take over. Now, there's some debate about whether she's still up there or whether she's falling. I'd read at the beginning of the week that she'd sort of been overtaken by Penny Mordaunt, by David Cameron, sort of people who'd come in and had a bit more of a moderate approach to just the way they handled other people, quite frankly. But you can imagine Rishi Sunak very obviously, I mean quietly, but obviously not giving his endorsement. He doesn't want to be unseated by her come the May elections. Do you remember that time that Penny Mordaunt came out with that amazing line about Liz Truss? Liz Truss is not hiding under a desk. I think we can expect a few more not hiding under a desk statements, because there are a lot of her colleagues who will definitely not be too unhappy, if her star falls.
I mean, I just suppose the other theory that you could advance, just put it out there, is that she's trying to get sacked. That she wants to be on the outside because she thinks this is a sinking ship.
A Suella, as we call it in the business.
Pulling a Suella, exactly.
Yeah, I don't know. I think she is. I think she prefers to be on the inside than the outside, and I think she's seen what's happened to Suella. Once you're out, you're really out. It's cold out there, and I suppose the other theory is that she's right.
Yeah, I was just going to say.
I mean, she could be correct.
We have to entertain that.
Yeah,
she is right.
She's right. Staunton is not telling the truth, or maybe there is some grey area, sort of misrecollection on both sides.
I tell you the trouble with that, though. She could have been right if she hadn't been so all-encompassing in her denial. She said no minister, no civil servant, and no department. Yeah. Now, what gets me is, how would you know? Right? The first thing you do if somebody came to you with something like that is go, well, I haven't heard that, but I'll go away and check.
I need all the facts in front of me before I go to the Commons.
And that's what Keir Starmer's asked. Rishi Sunak, are you going to do that? Kemi Badenoch, are you going to check on that? Why would you just say no straight away?
And this is the other. I kind of feel it's sort of weird in politics at the moment. I kind of feel like we've almost skipped 10 months or 12 months. Like we're paying so much more attention to kind of Labour's positions on all sorts of things, whether it's kind of Gaza or whether it's energy policy or whatever it happens to be, than we are often the Conservatives. It's like almost like they're the government as it is. And we're almost sort of looking at Badenoch, almost like she is the leader of the opposition already. And because this is a sort of scandal that could easily sort of bedraggle or bedevil a leader of the opposition. And the reason this also matters, even if she emerges from this and she survives, the question is how badly her reputation is damaged in the meantime. Because Conservative MPs will be looking at this and thinking, look, there's no doubt Badenoch is something of a kind of folk hero within parts of the Conservative Party because she is so uncompromising, because she is this sort of anti-woke figure, all of this sort of stuff. They like some of her agenda in government. Would she be a very good leader of the opposition? If you're leader of the opposition, you have to be diplomatic. You have to like journalists, or at least be willing to tolerate them. You have to be someone who's going to try and charm people. You have to sit down with world
leaders and sort of listen to them, right?
If you're Prime Minister or you're a Minister, you can afford to be uncompromising in the sense you have all the power. If you're leader of the opposition, you have no power. All you have is influence and you have profile, and you've got to be willing to diplomatically and strategically use it. So I think the danger for her in all of this, even if she doesn't fall as a result of it, is that Conservative MPs, a Conservative Party, look at her and think, is that really the person we want in an opposition period to be leading us. And, I think there are
But I
strong
do think
arguments to say no.
I think she's carved out a new place in the Conservative Party. And I think it's not the Trump style of Liz Truss or Suella Braverman. And it's definitely not the centrist style of the sort of the Hunts and maybe we once would have said the Camerons. I think she's speaking like somebody that the Conservative Party want to fall in love with. And I think large parts of it will be devastated if, she is proved to be a liar because she's their golden girl at the moment.
Well, let's just talk about somebody else who is in government at a very senior level, who has also fired. Well, I mean, the former head of the Post Office was not a civil servant, but he was head of a body where the ownership was in the hands of the government. And it's James Cleverly, the Home Secretary, who has sacked the head of the immigration watchdog in a row over the safety of the border. And why he's been sacked is not because he has said anything that was untrue or misrepresenting, but because he said it out loud. And that seems to be the criminal offence that has led to the Borders and Immigration Watchdog chief being fired.
Well, this is David Neal, right? It's the story of David Neal, who, to put it in context, was fired only a month before his contract would have run out anyway. I think it was running out at the end of March, exactly. But the Home Office saying to David Neal that he's got his figures wrong, right? The Home Office hasn't, however, given us any of those details. We don't know. I mean, he was the one who said private jets landing at London City Airport are getting away scot-free, are bringing people into the country who we simply don't know. We don't check their records, we don't check their ID, we don't know if they're high-risk suspects, we don't know if they're low-risk, and we don't know how many of them there are. And that seems to me a fairly useful thing to be questioning or asking.
Well, if you're the Chief Inspector
that's
for
your
Borders,
role,
you might think that is kind of in your wheelhouse, right?
So why would James Cleverly just want to shut that down? Why would you not want to say, again, going back to the Kemi thing, why would you not want to go, let's have a look, let's see how many people are going on, let's produce some reports into this? Why wouldn't you want to take that on board? And I guess the answer that comes back is, once again, embarrassment.
It's very unusual for someone in his position to be fired by a government minister or Home Secretary or whatever, particularly when the sort of crime was simply to speak out about something, as I say, which is within their remit. I mean, his reappointment as Chief Inspector had already been blocked, despite his predecessor serving 2 full 3-year terms in the post. And it's just worth hearing what he actually said about this airport story. He told the Daily Mail, "It's a scandal. It's incredibly dangerous for the country's border security. There should now be a rapid, independent inspection of general aviation across the country. The Home Office categorically rejected the claims. They said that Neal had chosen to put misleading data into the public domain." I mean,
but
choose
it's
who
not
you believe.
a small boat. It's a posh plane.
Yeah, well, right? Indeed. And look, either way, again, the government finds itself at odds with experts, with independent people who are effectively running the country, and he's paid a price for it.
But as I understand it, he had tried to raise these concerns with the Home Secretary and had not been able to get to see him, and had been trying to do this through what would be described as the normal channels. Yeah. And he hadn't been able to get anywhere. And so, clearly frustrated by that, he has gone public. And it is that which is, led to him being fired.
And it is worth pointing out that as a result of this, and the fact that the, independent inspector post on Borders is now vacant, there will be no one in that position whilst the Rwanda bill, whilst the Rwanda bill continues to go through Parliament, and hopefully the government gets it up and running in time.
If we just talk about our past lives for a minute, in the BBC, when there was a kind of problem and someone has screwed up, the phrase used to go around, "Deputy heads will roll." And we haven't quite got that with the government, but the government is finding anyone else to blame but itself, and we're seeing that with what's happened over the Post Office and now over the border.
In a moment, we'll be talking about Keir Starmer as seen through the eyes of his biographer, Tom Baldwin. Now, Tom Baldwin was originally a journalist, then a Labour insider. He worked for Ed Miliband, and now he has worked with the Labour leader, Keir Starmer, to produce this quite personal account of the stuff about Keir Starmer that none of us really knew. Well, joining us now is Tom Baldwin, the author of a biography on Keir Starmer called Keir Starmer, written Tom, should we say with the acquiescence of Keir Starmer, with his help?
Cooperation.
Cooperation.
But not authorised where he was kind of vetoing sentences.
He didn't put lines through your words.
No, the phrase I've used is authoritative, not authorised.
Right.
Wait, did he put lines through the stuff that he didn't want in?
No, the precise deal, because I'm very clear about the origins of the book, there was an autobiography before, and I was helping him write it. And so there's a vast amount of material which I'd gathered together for that. I think if you've got material for an autobiography, he still controls that.
Yeah.
So I said, the quotes you've given me before, those are your quotes and you can play around with those. The quotes I get from now on, they're mine, and you can't play around with those.
So, full disclosure, I read this a couple of months ago. I've done a quote for Tom on the back.
Very generous and fulsome tribute.
Well, what I said, actually, about the book was that you learn the story of a man who is actually incredibly ordinary in many ways, but has sort of done something quite extraordinary within that. And I think the stuff that struck me straight away was, we know that one phrase that Keir quite often sort of wheels out about the son of a toolmaker and the Pebble Dash house. What you don't know is about a very tricky relationship, actually, that he had with his father, and about the siblings, his 3 siblings, about the illness of his mum, which I think was a real influence, it sounds like, on all their lives, and about almost a sense of, I don't mean guilt, but discomfort from Keir about what he has managed to do and how uncomfortable that makes him in terms of the other members of his family. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. He's part of a generation which probably of Englishmen who don't particularly like talking about themselves all the time. I think the particular reasons why he doesn't want to talk about his family and parts of his family, because it's very raw and other people involved, including his siblings now, and he doesn't want to put them into the public eye any more than they want to be. And he is, partly through his background, quite tightly bound. There was a lot of stuff going on in that house with his mum's illness, his dad, who I think sort of shut out the light to some extent for the children there. His brother had difficulties learning. There was quite a lot of drama. And I think in those circumstances, you do sometimes close in on yourself. You can't make a fuss. You can't talk about your feelings because there's so much other feeling going on. Your mum's a priority. Is she going to die? To talk about your worries at school, or it just there wasn't room for him to develop into a sort of emotionally expressive person.
I suppose the thing I thought, reading it felt very post-war. It didn't feel that this was someone who was growing up in the 70s, 80s, 90s. It felt like this was someone who was in the 1950s. There was something about the Pebble Dash and the kind of modesty and the slightly lower middle class background. And as you say, that very buttoned up aspect of him that made me just feel this is a post-war generation. But I suppose the thing that it then made me think is, how suited is he for the 24/7 media spotlight, lights on you, big flashing grin that you've got to have, easy charm for the camera? Because it strikes me that is not who he is.
It's not. And I think one of the impressive things about him is he's learnt to do that pretty well. He's much better than he was 3 years ago. Look at an interview he did 3 years ago and one he does now. He learns, he tries, he perseveres, despite the fact he's not a natural politician. I think there's something kind of provincial and small town about him. He's not, people say he's just North London lawyer. No, there's something of...
he's from Surrey, isn't he?
Small town
Oxford,
is small.
Surrey.
And to be working class in a small town in Surrey is actually very different to being working class in Bolton. So there's lots of complexities to him because people are complex. Politics actually is much more complex than we pretend it is. And so much of our politics in recent years has been about these big visions or this grand spectacles. Tony Blair... painted these visions of castles in the sky, which didn't always get beyond the artistic impression. Boris Johnson gathered a huge crowd around him as he set fire to what we've got. And Keir Starmer, in a rather methodical, rather boring, dull way, talks about building blocks. And he puts one building block on top of another, and sometimes he moves it around, sometimes he changes his mind where it goes. But it's not much fun to watch. No one's going to stay and stare at that. But at the end of it, you might end up with a house.
Well, weirdly, the other thing that comes across here, and the two sound incompatible, but I don't think they are, is he's absolutely ruthless. I mean, there is a ruthlessness to him which you don't get, I think, from sort of seeing a speech or sort of seeing an instruction, because he's both self-effacing but absolutely convinced of where he wants to end up, right?
Absolutely. And this is one of the hardest things I've tried to reconcile in the book. I'm still puzzled by some of it. There's one story which I tell. So in, I think, 2021, he got COVID, and Ed Miliband, my old boss, was asked to step in at the last minute to do PMQs, and he did brilliantly. And lots of people are like, oh, there's the passion that we've been lacking. Why can't Keir Starmer be more like that? A lot of times when your understudy does pretty well, people are nose out of joint. He couldn't have been happier for Ed. On a human level, he knew it's cathartic for him. He sent messages to Ed. He sent messages to Ed's wife saying Ed should take lots more credit for what he's done so well. A few weeks later, he stripped him of half his portfolio and sacked him as business secretary. And so I said, how can you be so decent and human and so ruthless? And he says, I see no contradiction. They're just in different places. Decency is about my personal relationships. I've got to be ruthless if I'm going to be decent for the British people who really need a Labour government. And that compartmentalisation, that sort of separation, is pretty unusual. Most politicians have a faction. They've got their
just
friends.
To get that, so liked Ed personally, thought he was good personally, but didn't want Ed talking to the business community because he might have been thinking of the Predator's speech and the sense that he wasn't your best capitalist in the shadow cabinet, right?
Exactly. And Ed and Keir are quite close. I mean, Keir went to see Ed in 2008 to say he wanted to be Labour MP, and Ed helped him. Probably Ed is the MP Keir has known longest.
But you also get then the story of him trying to sort of demote or strip some of the powers of Angela Rayner in a reshuffle of the shadow cabinet. And even though Angela Rayner has her own mandate, having been elected as deputy leader, and so you can't get rid of her as that, and kind of not quite achieving what he wanted to.
Well, I mean, there's a terrible row and an unseemly row, and he handled it badly, and all people around him handled it badly because they were leaking that she'd been sacked before she knew about it, and she was quite rightly pissed off, I think. But he did get what he wanted, in that he wanted to have a new election coordinator, and he did. So stand back from all the smoke and fury. He did get what he wanted in that reshuffle.
It's interesting. You're still sounding not just like his biographer, but like his sort of spin doctor. You're
Oh, no,
defending
I hope
him
not.
a little bit.
Well,
Tom, let me ask you something, though. On a day where we are seeing the House of Commons voting on Gaza, ceasefire, very complicated wording on all of this, I'm wondering how stung Keir Starmer was last November. You must have been talking to him, putting the finishing touches to the book then.
I think the finishing touches came even later, to tell the
I'm
truth.
sure. Yeah. I mean, if you're like any of us, you're a journalist at heart. You sort of, January, February. But there was a moment, wasn't there, where he lost 50 votes of Labour MPs. And sure enough, this time round, they've had to find a new form of words to get round this question of whether Labour supports a ceasefire in Gaza. How rocked was he by that?
He screwed up. That's not sounding like a spin doctor, I hope. He did an LBC interview and he misspoke and he didn't correct the record soon enough and he let the issue fester.
A siege is appropriate? Cutting off power, cutting off water? Sir Keir?
Well, I think that Israel does have that right. It is an ongoing situation. Obviously, everything should be done within international law, but I don't want to step away from the sort of core principles that Israel has a right to defend herself.
What he did do then is learn. He didn't know a great deal about the Middle East, I think, before. He knows quite a lot about foreign policy. He's got quite a lot of foreign policy experience. But he wasn't particularly specialist on the Middle East. And he has really learned. He's flown to Qatar. He's spoken to the King of Jordan. He's spoken to Jake Sullivan. He's really immersed himself in this. And I think gradually he's become much, much more attuned to the sensitivities and complexities of that issue, which is very where Starmer likes to be. He likes complexities. He made a speech where he said, look, the shade of peace is grey. It's not black and white. You can't have this side right, that side wrong. And so
should he have got on to calling for a ceasefire earlier? That's what I'm saying. He lost 50 of his MPs on that vote, and now he's in the same place, really, as the SNP, pretty much.
Yeah.
So should he have gone earlier on that?
I think he was puzzled by the degree of panic and fury that set in within the PLP at that time. He says, look, this is not the Iraq War. Britain was not sending troops in, and they was not bombing anyone. It's about expressing opinion. Whatever happens tonight, by the way, it's not going to save a single life in Gaza. This is about the British Parliament expressing opinion, something which the British government does not have very much influence. And that's important. It's about, do you stand on the stage and posture and say this is all about what we, or do you, in Keir Starmer's view, say we're preparing for government, we're trying to show how we would act in government, we want to show potential allies that we could be a stable partner rather than someone who's going to shout on the stage and do...
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting because I think that on the Israel-Gaza issue, I don't know whether he's sort of pro-Zionist or pro-Palestinian in temperament, but he became the leader. And the dragon he had to slay immediately was anti-Semitism within the Labour Party, in the same way that Neil Kinnock had to slay the militant tendency when he became Labour leader. Has that defined him too much in terms of the policy position he's presented with when you've got Israel-Gaza? And it's not just about anti-Semitism, which was the Corbyn-era problem. It's a very different one now.
Keir Starmer is someone who doesn't like to be defined. It's very interesting. In one of the leadership hustings, he was asked at a Jewish Labour Movement hustings, are you a Zionist? Rebecca Long-Bailey said she was. Keir Starmer said, I'm not going to pin a label on myself. He doesn't like being labelled or having Zionist tattooed to his forehead or Blairite or Brownite or Milibandite or whatever. He's driven by values rather than labels and ideologies. And that is where you can get movement. If you don't come in to this as, I am a Zionist, this is my position, you actually have the ability to build a consensus, which a Zionist doesn't.
I just wonder whether that, in a more general sense, is a problem for Starmer, in the sense that the British electorate are going to be voting for him in 6 months, 9 months, whenever it happens to be, and they won't know who he is, what he is. Will the real Keir Starmer please stand up?
That's why I think it takes a book. He's not someone who can be described in an ism or a soundbite or a social media clip or even a speech. I think he's more like sort of common law. It sort of moves with the folds of the landscape. There are values there, and perhaps you have to see 2 or 3 decisions before you get a body of jurisprudence, before you begin to understand it. It's like pieces of a jigsaw. One piece doesn't mean anything. Put them all together and a picture emerges. So if you want to ask me who is Keir Starmer in a sentence, I'm going to refer you to a 400-page book because he's complicated. But I think politics is complicated. And part of the problem we've had in politics is we want to simplify everything. We want to say Keir Starmer's that, Rishi Sunak's that, Boris Johnson was that. And Christ, look what a mess we're in from all that.
Tom, you've also in this book got, I think, the first proper on-record interview with Sue Gray.
Possibly last as well.
Right. I mean, she becomes quite a central character in the book. I don't know how she's feeling about that or how Keir Starmer's feeling about that. I mean, I guess the question I'm asking is, how much does she control what's going on now? How much is she in charge of decision-making in the Labour Party? There was a story in the Times a couple of weeks ago about how much she'd pissed people off by taking their mobile phones and checking their messages over the leak about the change of direction on the 28 billion pledge. Talk us through where the power is with Sue Gray now.
She is someone who's been brought in to prepare Labour for power. And Keir Starmer was always very clear he wanted a civil servant rather than a political chief of staff, which was a big decision. Lots of people are saying you need a political chief of staff. If you are preparing Labour for power, you are inevitably involved in the kind of decisions you're making as a campaign. Apparently she sits in meetings now on policy and someone's saying we need a law and order crackdown, and she says, where are you going to put the new prisons? We haven't got enough prisons for all that. So she's talking the kind of pragmatic language of government.
Policy?
Which you don't always get in campaigns. Well, yeah, she has to, if she's preparing for power, she wants to know that Labour's offering policies which are credible and pragmatic and can actually be implemented.
Does she decide the timing of the £28 billion U-turn?
No, I don't. She's chief of staff. In the end, Keir Starmer decides that, but she is his appointment and she is exercising authority over staff, which hasn't existed for 9 months before.
She's banned WhatsApps, right?
Well, I think this is interesting.
Go on.
So one of the things that she was particularly disgusted, I think, by during the Partygate inquiry when she was still in the civil service was some of those WhatsApp messages. In that, you had some of the most senior civil servants in the country and senior politicians in the country exchanging these social texts, which are humiliating for a British government. So she's come in and said she does not want WhatsApp used for policy. Let's decide these things in meetings rather than in text messages afterwards. And I think that's about a grown-up approach to government. And look, Labour is beginning to think about government, and the building the planes they take off. It's good that they're thinking about government, but there's going to be tension between people thinking about government and people who've been campaigning for the last 4 years.
Is there a lot of tension?
Yeah.
I mean, I read what you read. There's clearly some people briefing.
You write it.
Well, no, but there's clearly people been briefing to newspapers about Sue Gray. My view of politics is if you're briefing, you're losing. If you're whinging about someone coming in and taking decisions, it's usually because you've lost those decisions. So I think the briefing against Sue Gray is a sign of her opponent's weakness.
Tom, before we started recording this interview, and I want to ask you this finally, we were asking, was Keir Starmer happy with the book? And you said happy-ish, kind of, I think was the word you used. Do you think he's unhappy about the centrality of the role that you have given Sue Gray in this book? And if he could change one thing, that is the thing he would change.
I have no indication of that. And I wouldn't say she's central. She's about 13 pages in a 400-page book. And she comes in at the end, it's a fairly chronological...
You get an impression of quite a big, powerful woman in those 13 pages.
Sue Gray is a powerful figure in the Labour Party and should be a powerful figure in the next government. That doesn't make her more powerful than any member of the shadow cabinet, but it makes her the most important member of staff. She is chief of staff, and that should be important.
If Keir had edited your book, what would be the bit he'd have taken out?
I think the things that he's most spooked by is the personal stuff. He is a very private man, and putting all this out there is quite raw for him. Yeah. And, I'd say, look, this is an unusual book. Political leaders in this country don't do books like they do in America, but usually they don't have time. I've got an incredible degree of access, and, this is a book about a leader who's a very cautious man. So all this material is coming out in this book. There are dozens of stories in this book. And if you've got a cautious leader in an election year and a campaign team worried about it, how fragile a 20-point poll lead is, of course people are going to be worried and spooked.
Tom Baldwin, thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
So there was a big story in local government this week, which, no, John, don't look like that.
I'm not looking like anything.
It's a very big story in local government, which is actually a massive story overall going towards the next general election and beyond. We covered it on the show before. This is about Birmingham City Council, which is the largest local authority in Europe. It's got over 1 million people. You might remember that they were forced to issue the local government equivalent, Section 114, of an insolvency notice, a bankruptcy notice, effectively. Government sent in commissioners to try and sort out the finances. There had been loads of problems, some of it specific to Birmingham, some of it about big cuts to local government over the last 15 years or so. They have announced exactly what the cuts are going to look like in order for them to balance their books. I mean, some of the numbers are incredible. So they announced this week they're going to have to sell £750 million worth of assets, cuts to public services of 300 million quid over 2 years, a 21% rise in council tax over 2 years, and it will have all sorts of effects. They're going to have to dim street lights, move to fortnightly bin collections. They're going to cut £50 million from children's services, £24 million from adult social care. It goes on and on and on and on. And that's big enough in itself because obviously Birmingham's such a big local authority, but it's the tale also that it tells more widely, which is that, yes, Birmingham has had specific problems. Yeah, there have been incompetence on the Labour-run council over the last 10 years or so, but it's also true to say that if a council like Birmingham, with its resources, cannot stem that tide and cannot resist the wider problems that local government has got in terms of, huge cuts, 40% cuts since 2010, that is coming to a local authority near you in the near future.
This is one of 8 local authorities in England that have now issued the Section 114, which is basically the one that sends you into bankruptcy. So the idea that this would just be local to Birmingham is complete chimera.
It's been Labour, Tory, Lib Dem.
Exactly. It's going to happen more and more. And I was just looking at what the council have actually said. I wish to apologise unreservedly for the significant spending reductions, but we have no choice. Yeah. I mean, that's where we are, right? That it's not something that they can pretend isn't going to happen, and it's something that they feel desperately sorry for, but can't do anything. I mean, all the cultural stuff that they used to give to in Birmingham, the orchestras and the arts and the drama, that's all gone. As you say, social care, adult social care, child care. It's a really scary place to be because we've done so much talk about localism, right? The importance of localism.
Yeah.
And if you think about the whole move under the Blair years was you
Take
have your
power
mayor,
away from
take
Westminster.
power away from Westminster, get on with it. And
also-
now you're basically stuck.
And also Birmingham, a city of great municipal pride, of the kind of great public buildings and the like. And you just think that there
Great
is an
Lewis
area...
Goodall.
Yeah, and there is an area of public
Went
life.
downhill from there.
And there's an area of public life now, of local communities and strong cities, that you just feel the changes that are going to be made. It's going to be a fire sale of assets. It's going to be a dramatic reduction in services. Some of them nice, like an orchestra, may be seen as a sort of kind of nice thing to have. But it's going to be core services as well when you're taking that much money out of the system.
But there's another national political implication as well, which is that, well, there are two. One is that more and more councils are going to be going to Whitehall, and that includes Conservative councils saying, we are right on the brink here. And honestly, this is rural councils, it's urban councils, it's district councils, unitary, county, the whole lot. The demands on their services...
take out the party politics of who runs the council.
Yeah,
it's going to be all of them.
Yeah, the demand on their services, particularly adult social care, but loads of other stuff as well, has been going up and up and up. The resources available to them have been going down and down and down. That's going to affect, whichever government takes over, there are going to be councils going to them asking for more resources, which gives them less money to spend elsewhere. But also, more and more councils are going to be asking the government to do what Birmingham has had to do, which is to say that there is currently a limit where a council cannot increase council tax by more than 5% or 4.99% without a referendum or permission from the government. More and more councils are going to end up doing what Birmingham has done, which is asking the government to give permission for massive increases. Well, what is the point? And you're hearing Tory MPs saying this as well. What is the point of, say, the government cutting income tax or national insurance if you're just going to make massive increases to council tax, which, by the way, are way more regressive than income tax or national insurance, because, of course, it's the poorest who pay more in terms of council tax as a proportion of their income, as opposed to income tax or NICs, which is
Well, you might find
progressive.
that the government says, well, that's even more incentive for us to bring down income tax because this is coming out.
I mean, it's difficult in local government because the government will say, which I can understand, which is that local authorities have to have some incentive to manage their finances well. And sometimes if they don't, and Birmingham in lots of ways hasn't, to be fair, but if they don't, then there has to be an incentive or disincentive, or an incentive for them to do so, and there has to be a disincentive contraries when they don't.
A penalty.
A penalty, I should say, yeah, exactly. But on the other hand, of course, who are the people who are going to suffer from this? It's going to be the million people who live in Birmingham. It's not the councillors in particular. It's all of the residents and obviously the particularly vulnerable people who rely on council services most. It's a really grim situation that's going to expand.
Before we go, we're talking on the Newsagents USA to Bernard Sanders.
Bernard.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because we all know him as Bernie, but I've only ever heard people call him Senator Sanders. Yeah. So he is the independent senator from Vermont, who thinks there should be, famously, no billionaires, who thinks
Big problem for you, John.
Yeah.
I wish.
who has written a book saying why it's okay to be angry about capitalism, and who didn't vote last week on the funding that would go towards both Ukraine and Israel. And he says that should be decoupled. We'll talk to him about a little bit of all of that, and indeed why he thinks Trump is ahead.
We do spoil people, don't we?
So much choice.
Honestly,
Yeah.
so much. We're a content factory. Let's
Lewis,
pat
when
ourselves on the back.
I was amazed when I flew back from Australia on my private jet and we just landed and there were just no checks on me whatsoever.
No, indeed. And there never will be. Not now. Not now Neil's gone.
See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.